Welcome everybody to the Civil Society Innovation Report series. This is the third one that we will be doing, and it will be covering civil society innovation and digital power shift. My name is Nyambura Mbugua. I am a communications consultant at the International Civil Society Center, and today I am wearing a black top. I am logging in from Kenya, from my home in Kenya. Joining me today will be Chris Worman, co-founder and senior advisor at connecthumanity.fund, previously of our innovation partner, TechSoup. Also joining us is Sophie Dyer. She is the product manager at the Evidence Lab with Amnesty International in New York. And finally, we have Berenguer joining us, and she is the team leader at SOS Children's Villages International, covering youth and ICT for development. Welcome, everybody. This Civil Society Innovation Report series highlights innovations and shares lessons that can benefit the international civil society sector, but also be applied to tackle big, common contextual challenges or opportunities. The center is grateful for the support from Cloudera Foundation and the Ford Foundation in supporting this project and this workshop. Additionally, we would like to extend a very big thank you to our innovation partner, TechSoup, for journeying with us through this. So here to present further on the details on the framework is Chris.
Hello, everybody. As mentioned, Chris Worman, until recently Vice President for Alliances and Program Development at TechSoup, but now co-founder and co-lead of a new fund for digital equity called Connect Humanity. I am wearing Silicon Valley business attire, which means a white button-down shirt, a gray V-neck sweater, and jeans. Happy to be here today presenting this framework because during now 20 years in civil society and technology, I've certainly become increasingly annoyed about how we, donors and civil society alike, tend to chase capital markets who are chasing shiny, pretty things. Blockchain and big data and crypto and AI and the frontier technologies that promise to help and save and accelerate, which they might and sometimes do, but rarely the way we'd hoped or planned, and almost never as sexily as was initially promised. And there are some fundamental reasons why. We attempted this framework to illustrate why, so that we can all remain just as excited as we want to be, positively or negatively, about technology, and most importantly, try to start getting on the same page. When designing this, we started at the end getting the most attention, frontier tech, AI, machine learning, bots, natural language processing, etc., the hype du jour. There are promises that it will save the day and excellent treatises on why it won't, like Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it. We worked backwards from that. What would AI need to not be racist, for instance? More data that looks less like me and more like the kinds of historically marginalized communities we usually intend to serve, for instance. Why don't we have their data in data lakes and data stores? Well, half of humanity does not have access to the internet. 2/3 of those who do are underconnected. Nearly 2/3 of humanity, therefore, isn't producing data. And they're the communities, again, that we usually intend to serve. So what would they need to produce data? Access to the internet? Policies that make internet usage safe, digital tools and skills, and teachers, essentially the building blocks of digital equity. So if you then are at that end of the spectrum, working your way from frontier tech down to digital equity and back up again, if they had those infrastructures, they could arguably produce the data needed to guide frontier technology. Best case, the data would be produced in a way that wasn't extractive, but generated through positive pro-human interactions on digital infrastructure like broadband cooperatives owned or informed by civil society. Best case, it's stored and managed in data trusts or lakes that are civil society operated or at least informed rather than simply ad markets who will naturally continue to prioritize the wealthy. If, there are a lot of ifs. And a lot of work for civil society, since the fair market will not bring disconnected community online. It won't provide relevant training or support, and most governments, frankly, simply don't know how. It's a long way to go. and a need for civil society to lead, which I think we can all appreciate, in innovating across each of these digital infrastructures, since those that we care about are being left behind as digitalization accelerates and the promise of a positive digital future for today's digitally poor fades. And no one but we in civil society will remain dedicated to ensuring the power of these structures ends up in the hands of those who are most likely disempowered by it. Long story short, this framework and the accompanying innovation framework is an attempt to help us not miss the forest for the trees. I'm not going to say it's perfect, but it is an attempt to gather and show superlative responses like those we will hear about today within the context of a framework, within context that might help us understand and communicate our work as part of a progress toward digital equity, inclusion, and transformation, rather than as standalone bright ideas. Hopefully it proves useful. Please do feel free to reach out with ideas on how to make it better, and looking forward to hearing some of these exemplary projects that are the beginning of our case studies. Back to you.
Thank you, Chris, for that presentation. Again, it's Nyambura speaking. If there are no questions, then I will follow up Chris's presentation by introducing Maria Berenguer to tell us more about the Digital Villages project.
Hi, hello everybody. My name is Maria Berenguer. I'm wearing white and blue street shirt with black trousers. And as Chris, shoes are not worthy to mention how they are because I'm working from home too. So they are like a home shoes, let's say. I'm talking to you from Spain, from Valencia, concretely. And as you can see in the slide, I am the team leader of the Youth and ICT4D team in SOS Children Villages International. So that's a team which is focused in supporting programs for young people and also digital programs. The project that I'm going to talk to you very briefly today, it's called Digital Village. And the main objective of this project, or one of the things that this project is really trying to tackle, is one of the basics of ICT integration at program level. In order to reduce inequalities and support SDG number 10, as well as equal access to education and opportunities, entrepreneurship, employability, etc., we are aware that we need to provide IT access to children and young people in our programs coming from different and very vulnerable backgrounds around the world. We in SOS, we work in more than 130 countries and territories, and access to education opportunities, entrepreneurship opportunities is not the same. And there are a lot of differences if we compare, for example, children and young people who have access to technology and those who don't have access. So it might sound like what's quite simple, but in fact, with this project, we really want to tackle the basics. So the basics of the problem, which is providing this equal access to IT and internet. Then the second part of the pillar, or the second step of the pillar that we want to tackle, if we can go to the slide, thank you, Nyambura, is the digital skills. We want to provide equal access and develop the digital skills. Third component, really important for us, and for many organizations, of course, is the cyber safeguarding component. That means that at the same time that we provide access and the skills, we need to make sure that the children and young people are empowered and they know which are the risks, because risks there are. So we want to educate them, to make them aware on which are the risks that are out there, that are in the internet, if you use technology, in order to prevent the risks, because it's always to be better to prevent them than then try to solve the problems. So that's why we provide this cyber safeguarding training course, awareness, and support. And then in the slide, you can see some of the numbers of the current reach that the project has. Next slide. But we don't do this alone, of course. I mean, like in SOS, we do it like all together with partners. We have like many partners coming mainly from the corporate world, but also like other child-focused organizations and community-based organizations to implement the program. And then we adapt the program at the local context, and also depending on the partner that is supporting us, we tackle like different components that you can see in the slide. So we focus, for example, in supporting entrepreneurship, or in supporting digital skills, safeguarding, education, women empowerment, or gender equality. But we really like designed the project locally together with our different offices in the different countries and the partners which come with us for the implementation. Thank you very much. And that would be the project in a nutshell. Happy to answer any question that you may have later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Again, this is Nyambura speaking. Next, we will have Sophie, who will be presenting the Decoders project based in New York City.
Thanks, Nyambura. So yeah, hi, I'm Sophie, and I just want to say thank you, Vicky and Nyambura, for inviting me to contribute, as yeah, all the panelists are new to me, so this is the first time we meet. I'm talking to you from London, and I'm wearing a blue jumper, kind of boring, but I am in a room with lots of posters behind me as I'm working from home. So my name is Sophie, and I work in Amnesty's Crisis Evidence Lab, and primarily on data-driven visual and participatory research projects. And as Nyambura said, I'm also the product manager for a project that we have that is called Amnesty Decoders. And now I know I've only got 5 minutes, so I'm going to be really brief. And I want to talk to you first about the most recent project we did, how we did it and why we did it. And it's called Decode Surveillance NYC. And then I'm going to try and briefly cover some takeaways from the project that is actually still live. So the story kind of begins with a quote, which is "looking for a needle in a haystack." And this is actually what the NYPD, so the New York Police Department, quoted to us when they rejected our request for information on the department's use of facial recognition technology. So now then, we're more than a year later, 7,000 volunteers later, and also access to Google Street View, and Amnesty is effectively I guess, search for tens of thousands of needles in a haystack the size of New York. And we did this by combing every section in New York City 3 times over to identify and categorize surveillance cameras, noting which of them are most likely to be publicly owned, importantly, of course, by the NYPD and government agencies. And unable to track uses of facial recognition technology, our goal became to map the surveillance cameras that feed it. So ultimately, we wanted to understand residents and communities' possible exposure to the technology throughout the entire city. And Amnesty became involved in, and Amnesty Decoders became involved in 2019, alongside a coalition of local partners, because of mounting evidence that facial recognition technology not only violates our human rights, the right to, for example, freedom of expression, assembly, equality and non-discrimination, but its application is also increasing. And there's also a lack of transparency and accountability, which means too often we cannot say where, when, or why the technology was being used. And stories of its use were well documented, but the data, and I guess this is why I'm really curious to talk to Chris about the definition of data lakes, data of its use, so public records, were effectively a missing data set. And there's a Nigerian-American artist and researcher, Mimi Anuha, who talks about missing data sets. And she calls them the blank spots that exist in otherwise data-saturated spaces. So whether the missing data sets in our experience about healthcare or housing, too often it's the minoritized groups that are disproportionately disadvantaged by the knowledge gaps that they leave. And for the last 5 years, Decoders has been working to fill these missing data sets and bridge the knowledge gaps. So I'm going to now talk specifically about Amnesty Decoders, but also refer back to the kind of legacy that is now 5 years of the wider Decoders program. So Nyambura, if you could actually switch to, the next slide. So how do we do it? How do we collect this data on the surveillance cameras? And also thinking about, I guess, the theme of this session on digital power shifts or challenging power. How do we do this through participatory research? And also how do we follow through on, I guess, this promise without amplifying existing inequities and inequalities? So I'm just going to briefly mention a few takeaways from the work. So Amnesty Decoders leverages, importantly, the wisdom of the crowd. And we do this through breaking up complex research questions into discrete micro tasks. And for Decode Surveillance NYC, we asked volunteers to look at a Street View panorama, so Google Street View, and to tell us when they saw initially a camera, then tell us what the camera is attached to, and then tell us the type of camera. And we asked, we didn't ask, but we got volunteers to check each intersection in the city 3 times. We then leveraged the mean, because it's least susceptible to outliers, to arrive at an estimate. And before anyone, I guess, asked the question about artificial intelligence, our study has actually been compared to an academic study that used machine learning. And in many ways, we were more effective in our survey. So second, we importantly use digital open source information, so information that is already in the public domain, and we make that information operational in campaigning and advocacy. So a primary goal of Decoders is to produce counter narratives, to leverage public or user-generated content to verify and ultimately pitch the realities and lived experience of marginalized communities against those touted by governments or powerful corporations. So my third point would be that Decode Surveillance also offered a way for people to meaningfully contribute to and feel part of the human rights movement, particularly during the pandemic. But of course, there are many other reasons why somebody might not be able to go out on the streets and attend a protest or donate to a cause. So our volunteer forum moderators, the group of volunteers that we work with most closely, range from school students to older persons. And as I said at the beginning, we had over 7,000 volunteers join from over 150 countries and territories. And what we know from 5 years of running Decoders is that peer-to-peer learning is absolutely critical to the success of complex crowdsourcing. So in Decoders, we make space for this via a moderated forum. And we found that the forum is crucial as it provides that peer-to-peer support and learning at a scale that we simply cannot. The project team is really small. And I guess lastly, I just wanted to end by saying, I think we, like everybody, can do so much more to address the digital divide. So we did a lot of work to ensure that the site did not require large bandwidth or data package or the latest operating system. And one challenge I will mention, there are many, is translation. And it's a particular challenge for Decoders because to deliver the project in multiple languages, we don't just need to translate the site and its resources, but we'd also need to moderate the forum in those languages. So one way we kind of worked to at least make the project available to volunteers who are speaking English as a second language and who may not be so confident with their English was to work closely with an artist to create pictograms to illustrate every instruction and multiple choice option on the platform. And ultimately, as I think with any measure that you take to improve accessibility, these benefited everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. That was very comprehensive. This is Nyambura speaking. Now I would like to move into the question and answer session. So please, anybody in the audience, if you have a question, do post it on the chat. To our speakers, please feel free to ask each other or myself any questions.
I have a question. Yeah, it's Vicky from the International Civil Society Centre. I was really interested in this point that Sophie made around building peer-to-peer capacity and support, and in a more networked model to really build the scale and impact of what you can reach. And I was interested to hear both Maria and Chris reflect on that aspect in your work as well, and if that's been critical and how you kind of deliberately built that. That'd be great, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like for all the projects that we have, and especially like the digital projects, we work a lot like with peer-to-peer support, and then also, yeah, at different levels, let's say, of what peer-to-peer means. So, for example, like in especially the projects in my department, we really work in partnership, for example, with young people. In order like to design the projects, and it's not only like to implement them, but they are really like involved in the design phase. And then it also helps like when we are going to scale and bring the project into the community, so that young people have been involved in the real design of the project and in the feedback, in the implementation, etc. It also helps to then bring it into the wider community, because they really become advocates of the project. And they become like as a member of the organization, as a full peer, let's say, for the project. And then another concrete example is, as I mentioned before, also with other like civil society organizations or with partners that are together with us, like in implementation in the project. So this is how we really, yeah, I think that this is the way that we can scale and have like a greater impact. On our own, that would be quite difficult.
Nothing much to add there, except, yeah, we could have a whole session on how and why I think many of us have done this work. I think the piece that I would emphasize in addition to what Maria brought up was the capacity for peer-to-peer programming to really spread culture around these, around technology thinking and usage. And part of what I love about Sophie's work is the way it includes people in a conversation about technology. And it's not just about crowdsourcing and crowd mapping, but it's making them a part of the process, the dialogue, the understanding. And through participation, they're going to walk away more savvy, more intelligent, more clearly, well, at least they'll have I think you can lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink. They'll have every opportunity to be more of a stakeholder in conversations about technology and society. And we often don't do that, especially with disenfranchised communities. So I think that's brilliant. And I would say, the question about how we could do more of it, you can try to build it on your own, but I would say if Sophie would give you an hour of her time, try to work with them and work with what they've already built. Microtasks, there are lots of different ways in which you can do that kind of microtasking, but I think basically every organization represented here today in an ICSC would benefit from a shorter distance between the people that we intend to serve and the decisions we're trying to make on how to build better programs. Microtasking can give us a lot of feedback on exactly what's happening out there within our communities. And I think there's a ton there that is absolutely worth exploring. And yeah, you could do it on your own. Or I'm sorry, Sophie, I'm setting you up for meetings.
Any other questions?
Sophie, you had a question earlier about data lakes.
Yes, I was just thinking, Chris, I know my talk was actually under the theme of data lakes, and I was just curious if you could talk more about that. I mean, to my mind, it is immediately a kind of, an analogy with a natural resource. So I just wondered how that was useful for you in thinking through the framework that you presented, the concept of data lakes.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So there are various data lakes, data stores. I try to avoid data stores because it conceptually gets too close to capitalism for me. And I think the idea, to your point about natural resources, of people saying, you know, data's the new oil. I wish people would stop saying that, because oil didn't work out so well last time for most folks. And it's just that sort of entire metaphor of data as an extractive, pulling data out of people's sort of existence into your own monetization. Not one that I think should make us comfortable. Data lakes, maybe a little better, but regardless, it's sort of where data is aggregated. And right now, most of those aggregation points are, and I can put a link in the chat here to a really interesting piece of work we did with World Economic Forum recently on the sort of data generators, managers, users, the rights and responsibilities of different people in a data chain, from the first time you click on something through to the way it's remonetized, through to what you are actually looking for. And so regardless, all of it goes somewhere. Or in the work that you're doing, it wasn't produced in the first place, and maybe it doesn't go anywhere. So trying to aggregate that data, working on where we store and what governance rights are over data is a really important part of this equation. You know, again, thinking about sort of the arc of data generation to storage to usage by frontier technologies. If the data isn't there, then the frontier technology can't very well represent it. The data lake sits right in the middle, is the place where the data sits. It needs to be in there, and as you know, we all probably have thought about and or heard about or talked about, highly structured in a way that is useful and usable to algorithms that might then provide some service on top of that data and the models that it relies upon. So I don't know what more to say about it. Like as a phrase, data lake, it's really more trying to encapsulate the place where the data sits. The point of it in this sort of arc was that half the time the data isn't there and can't be there because people aren't online or producing it. And then the data that is there is often sitting in corporate data stores, which are really set up for extraction over any other practical, useful human purpose. So that was why that term, maybe not the best one. If you have a better one, that'd be great.
And that was great, Chris, thank you. And I didn't want to leave with my question, but your answer was really comprehensive, and I think got to perhaps what I was thinking about, that is, when we identify at Amnesty a missing data set, there's often a reason why it's missing, right? There's a motivation for the data not to be collected, either by those who might use it, or because perhaps that group, you know, would be made more vulnerable by that data being available on them. So yeah, there's been a few projects that we have thought about that could have become decoders projects, but we have just decided against that data collection because it would not have met the advocacy needs or the risk of collecting it, which of course is also a risk that sometimes you know, there's a question of what you're exposing people to during the collection process, and the microtasking is simply outweighs the benefit of having that information. So I guess it's the question of which lakes, when we notice they're empty, do we decide to fill?
I think that's, you know, it raises, there's so many layers within all of this work, right? The data that is invisible because it doesn't exist. The data that is invisible because it is hidden, the data that is invisible because it is otherwise suppressed, the data that's there and useful. Like there are a lot of really interesting pieces to that equation. I think we were aiming for a more simple framework to help orient a conversation than an entirely comprehensive one, and maybe then we get lost.
Yeah, if I can say something, I think that what Sophie, you just said, it's really key on the way of, when we're implementing digital projects, one of the key things is that, okay, are we going to compile data? And then not like to have a yes answer, by default because it will help in our organization statistics, or it will help like in the whatever, because that can really harm, let's say, for example, the project or the people from which you are compiling the data. And I think that a good question, or a very key question that we always need to think, is that, okay, it's really essential for us like to get this personalized data, or can we, for example, extract results like without that personalized data, for example, and then would it make more harm to gather data than not to gather it, for example? I think that that is like this, yeah, big questions that maybe we all should think about before by default saying, yes, let's gather everything.
Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us today. I think this was quick and informative. I hope you all learned something, and hopefully see you at the next sessions.